The room always told him something before the offender ever spoke. A faint chemical sting from the disinfectant. The dull hum of fluorescent lights vibrating overhead. The stale chill that seeped into his skin as he sat down, waiting for the door to seal behind him. Christopher Berry-Dee had walked into hundreds of these interview rooms throughout his career, yet each one carried its own signature tension, a subtle shift in the air that hinted at the mind he was about to confront. Some rooms felt heavy with sorrow. Others buzzed with unspoken rage. But the rooms reserved for the guilty but insane had a different weight entirely, an unsettling stillness, like the quiet before a storm that never fully passes. He had come to understand something after years of speaking with those who crossed the line into violence. Insanity was rarely loud. It didn't always arrive in screams or wild eyes. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it hit. And sometimes it was nothing more than a mask, pressed carefully over a mind that knew exactly what it was doing. The challenge was never identifying the crime. That part was written clearly in evidence and testimony. The real challenge was determining what lived inside the person who committed it. Madness? Manipulation? Or some hybrid state where truth and deception intertwined so tightly that even experts failed to separate them? That question echoed through him as he opened the first file of this journey. This offender had been described as polite, soft-spoken, invisible in a crowd. The people who knew him struggled to reconcile the man they believed he was with the brutality he eventually unleashed. When the crime occurred, it shattered the illusion of normalcy in his community, leaving investigators scrambling to understand how someone who blended so easily into daily life could descend into violence without warning. The insanity plea arrived quickly, almost too quickly, and carried with it the familiar suspicion that clings to every claim of mental collapse. Was it real or was it strategy? When Berry-Dee stepped into the interview room, the offender looked up with calm, measured eyes. There was no tremor in his hands, no erratic movements, no frantic attempts to explain himself. Instead, he greeted Berry-Dee with a nod so composed it felt rehearsed. His posture was perfect, his breathing steady. He looked like someone awaiting a business meeting rather than someone pleading temporary madness in a court of law. Berry-Dee began with simple questions, details about upbringing, daily routines, family dynamics. The man responded with clean, organized answers, each delivered with a confidence that made the narrative feel polished rather than spontaneous. His childhood sounded ordinary. His work history stable. His social life unremarkable. Everything he said aligned seamlessly, too seamlessly, with the version of himself he wanted the world to see. But the smooth clarity in his tone shifted the moment the conversation reached the crime. His eyes softened. His voice slowed. He described a sudden mental break, a moment where reality tilted, and he no longer recognized himself. He insisted he had no memory of the violence, only a fog that swallowed him until he woke moments later. Berry-Dee had heard this story before, not the details but the cadence. The selective amnesia. The polished vulnerability. The emotional cues placed exactly where they were expected. It was the performance of madness, not the uncontrolled unraveling of it. He watched the man carefully, studying not his words but the spaces between them. The too perfect pauses, the conveniently vague descriptions, the way he monitored Berry-Dee's reactions like a chess player evaluating his opponent. True psychological breakdowns carried a kind of disorganized rhythm, a chaotic scattering of thought that even skilled communicators struggled to hide. But this man's narrative flowed with an uncomfortable elegance. Still, Berry-Dee didn't dismiss him. That would be a mistake. Some offenders learned to mimic normality for years before anything cracked the surface. Others learned to mimic madness just as well. And some existed in the blurred space between, an unstable mind capable of moments of dangerous clarity. As the interview deepened, Berry-Dee noticed small inconsistencies. The man claimed confusion, yet remembered the hours leading up to the event with sharp detail. He insisted he lost control, yet spoke about actions that showed planning. He denied awareness, yet betrayed subtle understanding of consequences. These cracks hinted at intention, not breakdown. But what unsettled Berry-Dee most wasn't the lies. It was the calm behind them, a stillness so deliberate that it suggested a mind fully aware of the persona it was crafting. He knew exactly how to appear fragile. Exactly when to soften his expression. Exactly how to shape his story around the idea of insanity without ever losing control of the performance. As Berry-Dee stood to leave, the offender offered a faint smile, polite, practiced, detached. It was a smile that said nothing and revealed everything. The interview ended, but the question lingered, echoing through the sterile corridor like a whisper. What does it mean to be insane when insanity itself becomes a weapon? This was only the beginning. Ahead waited minds shattered by trauma, others sharpened by cold logic, and some twisted into shapes that defied every label the system tried to assign. Berry-Dee braced himself. The journey into the gray space between madness and evil had only just begun. The next file waited on the table like a quiet riddle, its edges worn from the number of hands that had passed it along. Before stepping into the interview room, Berry-Dee reviewed the sequence of events again, letting the contradictions settle into his mind. This offender's story was unsettling not because it was chaotic, but because it was too balanced. A strange tension between clarity and confusion, lucidity and claimed collapse. The crime itself was deliberate, measured, executed without hesitation. Yet the moment arrest became unavoidable, the offender folded into a trembling shell of disorientation, insisting he had no memory, no intention, no sense of reality. Berry-Dee had met many who tried to weaponize amnesia. But this case carried a subtler undertone, like someone who had practiced the mannerisms of instability long before he needed them. Inside the interview room, the man sat with a posture so composed it contradicted everything written in the psychological reports. His hands rested gently on the table, fingers aligned neatly as though following a pattern only he understood. He looked up as Berry-Dee entered, offering a restrained smile. Not warm. Not cold. A smile designed to appear harmless. Berry-Dee greeted him and opened with easy questions, building a conversational rhythm. The man talked freely about his upbringing, recounting childhood stories with crisp detail. There was no hesitation, no fragmentation, no hint of cognitive struggle. His narrative flowed too smoothly to belong to someone fighting internal disarray. But when the conversation approached the crime, his demeanor shifted, so quickly and precisely that Berry-Dee recognized the pivot for what it was: performance. His shoulders sagged slightly. His voice softened. He described the day not as a sequence of events but as a blurred emotional fog. He talked about pressure he couldn't name, confusion he couldn't escape, thoughts dissolving into white noise. It was a nearly perfect script. Too perfect. Berry-Dee watched him closely, letting silence stretch between questions. Silence reveals what words try to hide. The man filled the quiet with a rehearsed vulnerability, lowering his gaze as though ashamed, sighing gently as though exhausted by the memory he insisted he didn't have. These cues were common among offenders attempting to sell a narrative of madness. But Berry-Dee had learned long ago that genuine breaks in reality did not follow dramatic beats. They were messy, jagged, unpredictable. This man was none of those things. Berry-Dee shifted direction. Instead of pressing the crime, he asked about the moments before it. The man spoke with precise clarity, places he'd been, things he'd done, conversations he remembered word for word. His memory only failed when the story approached the critical moment. When asked how he could recall everything except the act itself, he offered vague statements about dissociation, the kind lifted directly from psychiatric terminology. He spoke about losing time, about stepping outside himself, about the world turning distant. But the language lacked emotional authenticity. It was too academic, too polished, too detached from human experience. Genuine dissociation carries a kind of terror, a bewildered inability to anchor oneself to the present. But this man described it like someone reciting from a textbook rather than surviving it. Then Berry-Dee noticed something more telling. The man was tracking his reactions. Each time Berry-Dee's expression shifted even slightly, the man adjusted his narrative. A softer tone when sympathy seemed possible. A confused look when doubt crept in. A sudden tremble in his hands when he sensed Berry-Dee's interest fading. It was a choreography of emotional mimicry. But this wasn't the kind of mimicry born from psychosis. This was the precision of a manipulator who understood the psychological expectations of an insanity defense and shaped himself accordingly. Still, Berry-Dee knew better than to dismiss the story outright. Minds can fracture in subtle ways. And some offenders live years balancing between stability and collapse, learning to mask both their disorder and their intentions. But as he observed the man's steady breathing, consistent eye contact, and calculated pauses, the pieces aligned into a familiar shape. This was someone who understood the legal value of appearing unstable. Berry-Dee gently changed tactics. He asked whether the man ever feared losing control in everyday life. For the first time, the offender hesitated, an unscripted hesitation, thin but noticeable. Then he delivered an answer wrapped in the same polished uncertainty as before. But the pause had revealed something deeper. The man wasn't afraid of losing control. He was afraid of losing credibility. And that distinction mattered. The interview ended with the offender leaning back as if drained, offering Berry-Dee another soft, brittle smile. It was the smile of someone who believed he had delivered the right performance, hit the right emotional notes, said the right amount of not enough. Berry-Dee returned the file to the stack and stepped into the corridor. The air felt colder now, sharper. This case was a reminder of a truth he'd learned repeatedly on this journey. Madness could be real, fabricated, or exaggerated, but deception, true deception, carried a clarity that no hallucination ever could. And the next case waiting for him would blur that line even further, pulling him toward a mind whose instability seemed genuine, yet fractured in ways no diagnosis could fully explain. The next case drew Berry-Dee into a profoundly different atmosphere, a quiet, trembling sort of darkness that didn't announce itself with theatrics or calculated charm. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, like a fog creeping across the edges of a landscape. This offender wasn't performing confusion or weaponizing instability. He seemed caught in something, suspended between clarity and distortion, unable to fully understand the world he lived in or the one he'd created inside himself. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the man sat hunched slightly forward, fingers intertwined so tightly his knuckles whitened. His posture wasn't defensive, it was protective, as though he were bracing himself against a memory he feared might break open. He didn't look up at first. Only when Berry-Dee offered a quiet greeting did he raise his eyes that carried exhaustion layered deep within them, the fatigue of someone who had been running from his own mind far longer than anyone realized. Berry-Dee began gently. He knew the difference between a mind playing a part and a mind struggling to hold itself together. This man's voice had no polished edges, no practiced pauses. He spoke in uneven strands, sometimes coherent, sometimes drifting, his thoughts sliding unpredictably between past and present. His childhood, he explained, was uneventful, at least on the surface. A quiet home. Ordinary routines. No overt trauma. But beneath that simplicity, he'd always felt disconnected, as though observing life rather than living it. He described this sensation with a halting uncertainty, as if he had spent years trying to name something he had no words for. As the conversation shifted toward adulthood, the picture grew more complicated. He described long stretches of loneliness, nights filled with racing thoughts that never fully formed into anything he could understand. He talked about feeling watched, not in the dramatic, paranoid sense, but in a subtle way, as though the world had developed an awareness of him he couldn't reciprocate. His thoughts grew heavier, more intrusive, blurring the line between interpretation and imagination. Yet he hid these fears from everyone, convinced he was simply too sensitive or too stressed. Berry-Dee listened closely. The man's narrative wasn't crafted to impress or deceive. It wavered in ways that reflected genuine cognitive distortion, thoughts collapsing into themselves, drifting into tangents he didn't seem aware he was following. When Berry-Dee asked about the weeks before the crime, the man's breathing shifted. His voice trembled. He spoke about a mounting pressure inside his chest, a sensation that felt like being squeezed from the inside, tightening with each passing day. He explained that familiar objects began to feel strange, as though the world itself had tilted slightly. This wasn't psychosis in the theatrical sense. It was the subtle, creeping erosion of stability, a mind gradually losing its ability to interpret reality without distortion. When Berry-Dee asked about the crime, the man fell silent. The pause stretched long enough for the hum of the fluorescent lights to fill the room. Finally, he began speaking in fragments, each word pulled from a place he seemed terrified to revisit. He described the day not as a sequence of events but as a moment when the entire world seemed to narrow, collapsing into a single overwhelming perception, one that made him feel threatened, cornered, and desperate. He didn't describe hallucinations. He didn't reference voices. Instead, he described fear so large it eclipsed rational thought. He thought he was in danger. He thought someone meant him harm. And he reacted. When the fog lifted minutes later, he saw what he had done and broke. There was no pride in his recounting, no manipulation, no attempts to excuse. His voice quivered with something raw, horror at his own actions. He wasn't trying to convince Berry-Dee of anything. If anything, he seemed confused why anyone wanted to hear from him at all. He spoke like a man who believed he no longer had the right to exist in the same world he had shattered. Berry-Dee asked him whether he remembered feeling out of control before. The man nodded slowly. He admitted there were moments when reality felt thin, moments he ignored because they frightened him. Moments when shadows seemed to shift near the edges of his vision, not hallucinations but distortions of perception. He never told anyone. He didn't want to be seen as weak or unstable. Instead, he hid his symptoms until they grew too heavy to hold. What made this case so profoundly difficult for forensic professionals was that the man wasn't fully delusional, nor was he fully rational. He lived in an unstable space, the kind of psychological limbo that isn't loud enough to diagnose early but dangerous enough to erupt under the right pressure. He wasn't manipulating. He wasn't lying. But he also wasn't legally insane under strict definitions. His suffering was real. His remorse was real. His instability was real. Yet his actions were still his own. As the interview ended, the man whispered something that hung in the air long after Berry-Dee stepped out of the room. "I wish someone had noticed before I disappeared inside myself." Berry-Dee carried those words with him down the corridor. This case was a painful reminder that not all dangerous minds are monstrous. Some are simply lost, slowly, quietly, invisibly, until one catastrophic moment forces the world to see what they never knew how to express. And now he was about to face a case that stood in stark contrast. A mind that didn't crumble under pressure, but sharpened into something cold, calculating, and disturbingly self-aware. The next file brought Berry-Dee back into far more familiar territory, an offender whose mind didn't drift toward confusion or collapse, but instead arranged itself with chilling precision. Unlike the fragile uncertainty of the previous case, this one radiated control. Too much control. It was the kind of file that reminded Berry-Dee why insanity pleas were a battlefield of performance. Some individuals learn to mimic instability with the same skill they used to manipulate everything else in their lives. The moment Berry-Dee entered the interview room, he sensed the difference. The man inside wasn't slouched or withdrawn. He wasn't trembling or avoiding eye contact. He sat with one arm resting loosely across the back of the chair, posture relaxed, expression almost amused, as though this was an interesting diversion rather than a forensic evaluation that might determine his future. He greeted Berry-Dee with a calm nod, the corners of his mouth lifting in a polite smile that felt practiced rather than genuine. There was no fear in him. No confusion. He looked like a man confident in his ability to steer the narrative, even from within the walls of a secure facility. Berry-Dee began the conversation with broad, open-ended questions about the man's life. The offender answered smoothly, articulating his thoughts with a level of clarity that suggested intelligence and emotional detachment rather than psychological instability. His childhood was ordinary. His work life structured. His relationships functional enough to appear normal. Nothing in his history hinted at mental unraveling, at least not the kind he would later claim. But as soon as the conversation shifted toward the crime, the transformation began. His voice softened just a fraction. His shoulders eased downward. His gaze drifted slightly as though he was trying to look inward at memories he couldn't quite hold. He described a sudden mental break, a feeling of dissociation, a fog he insisted clouded his senses. He claimed to have felt a disconnect from reality, one so profound he couldn't comprehend his own actions. Berry-Dee observed the performance unfold with the trained eye of someone who had seen this act many times before. The cues were too clean. The shifts too controlled. Real psychological breaks did not come with theatrical subtlety. They unraveled speech, disrupted pacing, fractured narrative. But this man moved in and out of confusion, with the ease of an actor hitting emotional marks. To test him, Berry-Dee changed direction abruptly, asking a series of unexpected questions. The offender handled each shift with ease. Too much ease. His memory sharpened when it benefited him, blurred only when it approached key moments that could show deliberate intent. He used phrases lifted directly from clinical terminology, stringing together concepts that sounded like symptoms but read more like artifacts from late-night research. This wasn't a mind unraveling. This was a mind constructing. Berry-Dee leaned in slightly, adjusting the rhythm of the interview. He asked the offender to describe specific sensations he felt during the supposed break. The man offered detailed answers that seemed pulled from psychology articles rather than lived experience. He referenced derealization, emotional detachment, intrusive distortions. But he lacked the emotional residue that accompanies such episodes. His voice didn't tremble. His pacing didn't shift. His breath remained steady. Berry-Dee shifted again, this time asking about details he knew would expose inconsistency. The offender hesitated, just a heartbeat too long, then offered new information that contradicted earlier statements. When confronted gently, he moved into a controlled form of vulnerability, sighing, lowering his gaze, trying to evoke sympathy rather than clarity. It was a seamless transition but not an authentic one. The turning point came when Berry-Dee asked whether the offender ever feared losing control outside the moment of the crime. Instead of reflecting, the man immediately adopted a wounded expression, claiming long-standing emotional instability. But he made a critical mistake. He described symptoms that didn't align with his earlier timeline. Genuine instability doesn't appear only at convenient moments. It bleeds across daily life, leaving a trail of behavioral shifts. His symptoms existed only where the legal advantage lay. The mask slipped further when Berry-Dee asked whether he felt remorse. The offender hesitated, too long for someone experiencing genuine torment. When he finally answered, it was with a carefully measured sorrow, one that felt aligned to what he believed evaluators wanted to hear. But his eyes remained cold. And coldness has no script. Berry-Dee closed his notebook slowly, letting the silence settle. Silence is a powerful mirror. Offenders often fill it with their truth or their fear. This man filled it with nothing at all. He simply watched Berry-Dee, eyes sharp, calculating, waiting. Not nervous, not confused, just assessing. As the interview concluded, the offender leaned forward slightly, offering a final comment meant to appear humble. But a hint of irritation slipped through, just a flicker in his eyes, when he sensed Berry-Dee had not fully accepted his narrative. It was the closest he came to honesty. Leaving the room, Berry-Dee felt a familiar heaviness. Cases like this didn't reveal crackling madness or tragic psychological collapse. They revealed something else entirely, a mind willing to bend, distort, and imitate illness if it offered a pathway toward leniency. Madness, in the hands of such individuals, wasn't an experience. It was a tool. And the next case waiting in the stack would challenge him further, not with manipulation, but with a dangerous blend of real instability and conscious calculation, tangled so tightly that no one could say where one ended and the other began. The next file greeted Berry-Dee with a stark shift in tone, a case marked not by manipulation or feigned fragility, but by a heavy, lingering grief that seeped from every page. This offender's story was already infamous, not for theatrics or sensational quotes, but for the uncomfortable blur between psychological collapse and accountability. It was a mind that hadn't shattered dramatically, it had fractured quietly over years, cracking along emotional fault lines no one noticed until the rupture erupted in a violent act. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the woman sitting at the table looked nothing like the public imagined. Her posture was rigid yet fragile, as though she were holding herself together through sheer will. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers intertwined, and her eyes, soft, clouded, deeply exhausted, tracked Berry-Dee with a kind of wary gratitude. She looked like someone who feared being judged, not someone prepared to perform. He introduced himself gently and she gave a faint nod, almost apologetic. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet enough that the air in the room seemed to lean closer. Her childhood, she explained, was stable, uneventful, even loving at times. She didn't carry the scars of trauma or abuse that often shadow other offenders. But what she did carry was a long history of internalized pressure, expectations that built gradually, subtle as dust collecting on a windowsill. She described herself as a people-pleaser from a young age, terrified of disappointing others. She lived her life trying to keep everything perfectly balanced, never allowing cracks to show. But perfection is a fragile mask. And hers began splitting long before anyone noticed. As she moved into adulthood, she experienced periods of overwhelming anxiety she couldn't explain, emotional spirals she hid behind practiced smiles. She talked about nights spent awake, heart pounding, mind racing with fears she couldn't name. She described moments when her thoughts slipped into a fog so thick she felt detached from her own actions. Tiny, invisible fractures. None severe enough to be recognized but dangerous in their accumulation. When Berry-Dee asked about the months before the crime, her voice trembled. She clasped her hands tighter, knuckles paling. She described feeling like she was living in a shrinking corridor. Every responsibility, every expectation, every minor stressor felt amplified. Her thoughts began slipping, drifting. She felt cornered by pressures she couldn't articulate. Yet she told no one. She had spent her life pretending she was fine, and that habit had become a prison. Then came the day of the crime. Her breathing hitched as she tried to speak. The memory wasn't clear. It flickered like a malfunctioning light, illuminating fragments she wished she could unsee. She described a wave of emotional overwhelm, a tidal surge of fear, despair, and suffocating panic. She said the world around her twisted into something threatening, distorted not by hallucination, but by unbearable pressure that her mind could no longer contain. What happened next was devastating, irreversible, and far outside the person she believed herself to be. When the fog lifted, she collapsed. She didn't run. She didn't defend herself. She simply sat in the aftermath, trembling uncontrollably, unable to comprehend what she had done. Officers found her crying, repeating the same helpless question, "How did this happen?" As Berry-Dee listened, he recognized something rare: authentic remorse stripped of self-preservation. She wasn't trying to escape responsibility. She wasn't trying to convince him she was insane. She was mourning the destruction left behind by a moment she couldn't emotionally or psychologically withstand. The difficulty, however, lay not in her sincerity, but in the nuance of her mind. She wasn't psychotic. She wasn't delusional. She understood right from wrong. But she also experienced dissociation-like episodes, intense emotional flooding, and distorted perceptions brought on by extreme internal pressure. Her mental state had eroded slowly, invisibly, until one moment of catastrophic overload pushed her beyond her ability to control her actions. This was the kind of case that split courtrooms in half. Some experts argued she wasn't legally insane because she retained awareness. Others insisted her mental collapse was so overwhelming that she could not have acted with rational intent. And beneath all of it, her quiet sorrow lingered, an ache that colored every word she spoke. When Berry-Dee asked her what she wished she had done differently, she looked up with glassy eyes. "I wish I had broken earlier," she whispered. "I wish I had asked for help before it was too late." It was one of the most painful truths he had heard in such interviews. Some people crumble silently under unbearable emotional weight until the collapse becomes invisible, even to themselves, until the moment it erupts with devastating force. As Berry-Dee exited the room, her final words followed him like a soft echo, reminding him that the difference between sanity and collapse isn't always a dramatic divide. Sometimes it's a quiet slope, easy to descend and impossible to recognize until the bottom drops out. Ahead lay a case with an entirely different flavor. One where instability wasn't a tragic byproduct of emotional erosion but a calculated performance sharpened into a weapon. The next case brought Berry-Dee face to face with an offender whose instability didn't stem from trauma or emotional erosion, but from something far more unpredictable: an internal volatility that shifted like weather, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, and always slightly out of step with reality. Unlike the soft-spoken sorrow of the previous interview, this case radiated an unease that couldn't be traced to one cause. It was the kind of mind that didn't break cleanly; it splintered in multiple directions at once. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the woman was already seated, posture upright but tense, as though she were balancing on an invisible edge. Her appearance was neat, almost meticulously so, yet her eyes betrayed a fractured depth, an unfocused searching, as if she were trying to stay anchored to the present moment. She greeted him softly, her voice steady but stretched thin. The early part of the conversation moved gently through her background. She described a normal childhood, stable environment, supportive family, nothing that hinted at the turmoil she would later experience. But buried beneath the surface of her calm recollection were clues, fleeting references to feeling different, moments where she felt emotionally detached or overwhelmed without understanding why. She had never been taught to name these feelings. Instead, she hid them, masking confusion with politeness and emotional numbness with compliance. As she transitioned into adulthood, her narrative shifted. She began describing long periods of dissociation, though she didn't use that word. She spoke of feeling like a passenger in her own life, of memories that felt foggy around the edges, of moments where her emotions surged unpredictably, leaving her disoriented and scared. She experienced flashes of panic triggered by seemingly insignificant things. Yet she convinced herself she was simply overreacting, adapting by shrinking herself emotionally to stay functional. Berry-Dee listened carefully. This wasn't someone inventing symptoms. Her language lacked the polished structure of rehearsed madness. Her stories unfolded unevenly, with genuine confusion in the gaps. He could sense that her mind had been struggling long before the world noticed. When Berry-Dee asked about the months leading up to the crime, her composure faltered. She swallowed hard, fingers twisting together as she described a growing heaviness that settled into her mind. She felt pressure, constant, suffocating, building behind her thoughts. Her sleep fractured into restless intervals. She described panic as a physical sensation, a tightness in her chest that grew sharper each day. And then, more troublingly, she began experiencing perceptual distortions. Nothing as dramatic as hallucinations. More like shadows behaving oddly, sounds seeming too sharp, emotions rising too fast for her to process. She tried to push through it, to keep functioning, to maintain the appearance of stability. But the harder she tried to hide it, the more violently her internal world buckled. Berry-Dee asked her what she remembered about the day of the crime. Her voice trembled as she spoke. She recalled an argument, nothing extraordinary, but something in her mind snapped. The pressure she'd been carrying surged into a kind of internal chaos she couldn't regulate. Her thoughts tangled into panic, fear, and distorted perception. She felt hunted, not by a person but by the weight of everything collapsing inside her at once. She described the moment before the act as being pulled underwater, unable to think or breathe. Then came a burst, a catastrophic release of internal tension. And when clarity returned, she saw what she had done and broke apart completely. Unlike manipulators who feign madness, she didn't claim amnesia. She remembered too much: the panic, the disorientation, the blurring of emotion and action. She didn't hide behind psychiatric terminology. She didn't attempt to dramatize symptoms. Her recounting was raw, fragmented, authentic. What made her case so legally complex was this: she wasn't delusional, but she wasn't stable either. She wasn't psychotic, but she wasn't in control. She wasn't malicious, but she wasn't functioning rationally. Her crime existed in a psychological twilight zone, a catastrophic moment produced by a mind fraying under unbearable pressure. When Berry-Dee asked if she felt remorse, her eyes filled instantly. She didn't cry for herself. She cried for the victim. "I should have broken earlier," she whispered, echoing a sentiment he had heard before. "I should have let someone see me falling apart." Her remorse wasn't strategic. It was devastatingly real. As the interview ended, she offered a final, trembling confession, not about the crime but about the fear she lived with daily. "I don't know what part of me did it," she said, voice cracking. "But I know it was me. And I don't know how to live with that." Berry-Dee left the room in heavy silence. She wasn't evil. She wasn't fully insane. She was something far more tragic. A person whose internal collapse had gone unnoticed until it manifested in the worst possible way. Cases like hers challenged every rigid definition of sanity the legal system relied on. And waiting in the next file was the complete opposite. A person who embraced the idea of madness as a weapon, wielding it with a disturbing blend of strategy and performance. The next case shifted the atmosphere sharply. Gone were the trembling hesitations, the fragmented thoughts, the quiet despair of someone collapsing under emotional weight. This offender radiated a very different energy, one that hummed with controlled chaos, sharpened cunning, and an unsettling delight in the ambiguity of madness. Some offenders feared being labeled insane. Others tried desperately to avoid it. But this one embraced the concept with theatrical flair, twisting it into a cloak of superiority. When Berry-Dee stepped into the room, the man didn't sit still. He paced slowly, almost rhythmically, as if warming up before a performance. The moment he sensed Berry-Dee's presence, he spun around with a grin stretched too wide across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even threatening. It was a grin crafted for effect, a deliberate distortion meant to make the observer uncertain. "Finally," the man said, voice dripping with amusement, "the man who speaks to monsters." His tone flirted with mockery, setting the stage for a psychological duel rather than an interview. Berry-Dee simply took his seat, refusing to meet theatrics with reaction. Silence settled. The man's grin faltered slightly before reforming into something more calculating. He began talking immediately, launching into a monologue about cosmic signs, hidden truths, and forces guiding his destiny. His words soared into flamboyant descriptions, visions, energies, messages from the unseen. But beneath the dramatic cadence lay something unmistakable: control. He watched Berry-Dee as he spoke, gauging each tiny shift, searching for impact. For some offenders, the performance was the point. For him, the performance was a weapon. Berry-Dee asked what he believed these visions meant. The man's expression flickered, just for a moment, as though he hadn't expected the question to be turned back to him so simply. He recovered quickly, claiming he was chosen, enlightened, misunderstood by those too ordinary to grasp his truth. His voice shifted with every sentence, sometimes grandiose, sometimes soft and conspiratorial, like a man switching masks. But the longer he spoke, the clearer it became. His story wasn't rooted in genuine delusion. It was rooted in strategy. His visions were inconsistent, changing mid-sentence. His voices were vague, lacking the vivid specificity that accompanies real hallucinations. His emotional tone didn't match his claims. He described terrifying supernatural commands with calm detachment, and minor details with exaggerated passion. It was a patchwork of dramatic fragments stitched together to create the illusion of instability. Yet beneath the showmanship, there was something genuinely unsettling. His attention. He watched Berry-Dee like a predator watches movement, calculating, analyzing, adjusting. This wasn't the gaze of someone lost in disordered thinking. It was the gaze of someone sharpening himself against the reactions of others. Berry-Dee shifted the conversation toward the crime. The man paused theatrically, lowering his voice to a whisper as though sharing a great secret. He described the event with vivid imagery, too vivid, language crafted to provoke rather than explain. He painted himself as a vessel guided by forces beyond comprehension. But his details betrayed him. He remembered too much. He described planning steps, timing choices. He slipped into moments of pride, only to quickly mask them with feigned confusion. Then came the most telling shift. When Berry-Dee showed no emotional reaction, no discomfort, no shock, the offender grew restless. His pacing resumed, but faster now, less polished. The performance wasn't landing the way he intended, so he changed tactics. He suddenly slumped into his chair, eyes unfocused, voice trembling as he spoke about losing control, about slipping into a void, about waking up covered in the aftermath of something he couldn't understand. It was too sudden. Too timed. Theatrics, not fracture. Berry-Dee leaned forward slightly and asked a simple question. What did you feel afterward? The man made his second mistake. He thought too long before answering. Then finally said, relief. It was a slip, just a flicker of honesty that cracked through the mask. Not guilt. Not fear. Relief. And relief doesn't come from hallucination or confusion. Relief comes from intention fulfilled. Berry-Dee didn't need to challenge him. The truth of who he was lived in the spaces between his practiced insanity, the cold calculation, the ego woven through his words, the delight in control. This man didn't want to escape responsibility through madness. He wanted to rise above it, to claim madness as a form of superiority, a way to elevate himself beyond morality. His unpredictability wasn't evidence of mental illness. It was a deliberate strategy. At the end of the interview he flashed another grin, sharp, performative, hungry for reaction. Berry-Dee simply nodded and left the room, refusing to give him the satisfaction. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing the man in the theater of his own making. Cases like this were reminders that insanity could be imitated, exaggerated, or distorted into a mask. But beneath that mask the truth often revealed itself, not in words but in intention. Ahead waited a case that would plunge Berry-Dee into a different kind of darkness. A mind shaped by trauma so deep that the boundaries between illness and accountability became nearly impossible to define. The next case drew Berry-Dee into a far more somber atmosphere. A mind shaped not by manipulation or theatrical self-importance, but by years of quiet, unspoken suffering. This was the kind of psychological landscape where danger didn't erupt suddenly. It accumulated slowly, quietly, in shadows no one thought to look into. Trauma had left fingerprints on every part of this man's life, yet none of them were dramatic enough for others to notice. His collapse wasn't an explosion. It was erosion. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the offender sat with a rigid stillness, shoulders curved inward, hands clasped tightly as though holding himself together. His eyes flickered upward only briefly before returning to the table. He didn't carry the evasive alertness of a manipulator or the shifting energy of someone performing instability. Instead, he radiated exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in the bones. Berry-Dee began with simple questions to ease him into conversation. The man answered quietly, voice low and unsteady. His childhood on the surface seemed ordinary. No violence, no chaos, no instability. But as he described it, small details signaled deeper wounds. An emotionally distant parent. A home where vulnerability was discouraged. A childhood spent trying to avoid conflict by becoming invisible. These subtle forms of neglect often go unseen, yet they carve deep patterns, teaching children to swallow fear, hide confusion, suppress anger until it warps into something unmanageable. As the man spoke about adolescence, the patterns grew clearer. He described moments of intense anxiety he couldn't explain, intrusive thoughts he pushed aside, and a persistent sense of being overwhelmed by emotions he never learned to regulate. He described shame around seeking help. Shame around failing. Shame around simply feeling anything too intensely. By adulthood the cracks had widened. He spoke about long periods of emotional numbness punctuated by sudden waves of panic. He described nights where sleep became impossible, his mind racing with dread he couldn't name. Days where he felt detached from the world as though he were moving through fog. He never told anyone. He believed suffering in silence was normal. Berry-Dee recognized the signs immediately: complex trauma, emotional suppression, and chronic dysregulation quietly saturating a person's life until their mental world became unsteady. These conditions don't announce themselves with theatrics. They creep in like shadows. When the conversation shifted to the weeks before the crime, the man's voice shook. He described overwhelming stress, small triggers that accumulated until he felt trapped inside his own mind. His thoughts spiraled into catastrophic interpretations. Simple interactions felt threatening. Ordinary comments sounded accusatory. The world grew sharper, louder, too fast for him to process. Then came the breaking point. The day of the crime began uneventfully. But beneath the surface, his internal pressure was reaching critical mass. A misunderstanding, something minor, ignited the fear he had carried for years. His thoughts scrambled into chaos. He described feeling cornered, suffocated, unable to tell where fear ended and reality began. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't delusional. But he was overwhelmed by panic so severe it distorted perception. He reacted, not from malice but from a catastrophic collapse of emotional control. When clarity returned, he was horrified. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't fabricate alibis. He sat down, shaking uncontrollably, whispering apologies the officers didn't know how to interpret. He confessed immediately, not to evade responsibility, but because he genuinely couldn't comprehend how he had become capable of such harm. Berry-Dee asked him what he felt afterward. The man shut his eyes, breathing unsteadily. "I felt like something inside me broke," he whispered. "Something I didn't even know was holding me together." There was no manipulation here. No performance. No attempt to weaponize instability. The tragedy of his case lay not in deception, but in the invisible suffering that had gone unnoticed for years. The hardest part for forensic experts was the classification. He wasn't legally insane. His grip on reality remained intact. He understood right from wrong both before and after the crime. But his emotional world had collapsed so violently that he acted without access to reason in the crucial moment. His case existed in that impossible legal space where morality, psychology, and law failed to align. In the silence that followed his final statement, Berry-Dee felt a wave of empathy tempered by the gravity of what had happened. Minds like his challenged the courtroom's rigid categories. They didn't fit the neat boxes of mad or evil. They lived in the painful space between, a space shaped by years of carrying emotional burdens alone. As Berry-Dee left the room, he reflected on how many lives unravel quietly, unnoticed, until one violent moment forces the world to pay attention. But the next case waiting in the stack would swing the pendulum sharply in the opposite direction. A mind whose darkness carried not the softness of suffering, but the chilling clarity of deliberate absence. The next file felt colder before Berry-Dee even opened it. Not tragic like the last case, not theatrical like the manipulator before that. This one radiated an emptiness that sat heavy on the page. Some offenders are shaped by fear. Some by delusion. Some by unbearable emotional weight. But a rare few are shaped by absence. A void where emotion should have lived, an internal quiet so profound that violence emerges not from chaos, but from an unsettling stillness. When Berry-Dee stepped into the interview room, the offender was already seated, posture straight, hands resting loosely, gaze forward. He didn't look anxious. He didn't look angry. He simply existed, calm, composed, unnervingly still. The kind of stillness that makes a room feel colder. He looked up when Berry-Dee entered, offering a polite nod, an almost formal acknowledgement. His eyes were dark but empty, not hollow from grief or madness, but from a lack of emotional resonance. Berry-Dee had seen this type before. Minds that didn't fracture from pressure, but were constructed in a way that made empathy optional and remorse irrelevant. Their conversation began with background details. His childhood was uneventful. No trauma. No neglect. No instability. Yet when he described it, there was no warmth, no emotional context. Just facts delivered with the precision of someone reading from a file. School was acceptable. Friendships were functional. Family relationships were maintained. His language hinted at distance, as if he observed his own life rather than lived it. His adulthood followed a similar pattern. Stable job, routine life, predictable habits. But stability without emotional connection can form a strange foundation. One that allows a person to function perfectly while lacking the internal mechanisms that regulate moral boundaries. When Berry-Dee guided the conversation toward the psychological components of his life, the man answered with unsettling clarity. He didn't describe anxiety. He didn't describe confusion. He didn't describe overwhelming emotions. He described nothingness, a consistent, quiet detachment from the world around him. Not sadness. Not numb despair. Just absence. It was this absence that made the crime so chilling. When Berry-Dee asked about the act itself, the man offered a clinical recounting, detailing each step with disturbing precision. No tremor entered his voice. No guilt leaked through. He described initiating the act not out of anger or fear, but because he recognized an opportunity. That phrasing alone told Berry-Dee more than any psychological evaluation could. This was not madness. This was intention. Berry-Dee leaned forward slightly. "Did you feel anything?" he asked, "before or after?" The man paused thoughtfully, not emotionally, before answering. No. Feeling wasn't part of the equation. Berry-Dee recognized the chilling truth. This man wasn't faking insanity. He didn't need madness to explain his actions because his mind operated with a logic unbound by empathy. He was clear, coherent, and rational. His world simply lacked emotional constraints. Yet when overwhelming evidence pinned him to deliberate action, the insanity plea emerged, late, strategic, and paper-thin. Suddenly he began describing dissociation. Suddenly he claimed confusion. Suddenly he remembered shadows at the edge of his vision, an overwhelming urge, a detachment from reality. But the performance carried no emotional texture. His descriptions were neat, organized, clinical, lacking the messiness of true psychological fracture. His pulse didn't shift. His gaze didn't waver. His breathing remained steady. This wasn't a fragmented mind. This was a calculated mind seeking legal shelter. When Berry-Dee pressed for specifics, sensory details, emotional shifts, cognitive distortions, the man faltered for the first time. He avoided the question, redirecting to philosophical musings about morality and perception. It was a deflection to avoid admitting the truth. His actions were deliberate and he knew it. Berry-Dee shifted approach. "Tell me," he asked, "what do you believe should happen to someone like you?" The man's expression remained placid. "Punishment is irrelevant," he said calmly. "Correct outcomes are what matter." "Correct outcomes?" Berry-Dee repeated. "For whom?" "For the system," the man replied with simplicity that felt colder than any threat. He didn't fear prison. He didn't fear psychiatric commitment. He didn't fear judgment. His only concern was efficiency, as though consequences were merely administrative details. As the interview drew to a close, the man adjusted his shirt cuffs with meticulous precision, an ordinary gesture made eerie by the emotional void surrounding it. Berry-Dee realized that the danger in this case wasn't insanity. It wasn't delusion. It wasn't rage. It was the calm. Some minds erupt. Some crumble. Some lash out in fear. But minds like his do something far more unsettling. They act without emotional interference. Such offenders often pass unnoticed in daily life, blending seamlessly into society because they lack the turbulence that reveals instability. But their stillness hides a deeper threat, a capacity for violence untouched by guilt, empathy, or internal conflict. As Berry-Dee stepped out of the room, he felt a coldness settle into his chest. Cases like this exposed the flaw in the insanity plea. The legal system assumed danger came from distortion. But sometimes the greatest danger came from clarity stripped of conscience. Ahead lay a case that pulled him back into uncertainty, a mind shaped by subtle fractures that the world overlooked until those cracks widened into catastrophe. The next file lay open like a knot, complex, tangled, and impossible to categorize cleanly. It wasn't the cold emptiness of a conscience-free mind, nor the fragile unraveling of a traumatized one. It lived somewhere between, a perplexing blend of controlled behavior and psychological erosion. Even seasoned professionals struggled to agree on what they were looking at. The file contained contradictions, fragmented insights, and conflicting psychiatric evaluations, each painting a slightly different portrait of a man whose mental state hovered in a gray zone the law was never designed to interpret. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the offender sat with hands folded neatly, posture impeccable. Not defensive. Not anxious. Just composed. There was something unsettling in the way he held himself. Like someone who understood the importance of appearing stable, but wasn't entirely sure how to replicate human emotion. He lifted his gaze and nodded politely, his expression mild but distant. Berry-Dee recognized this type immediately. Individuals who functioned well enough to appear normal, yet operated with emotional circuitry that never fully connected. They weren't devoid of feeling. They simply didn't experience emotion with the depth or direction needed to guide moral behavior. Berry-Dee began with familiar ground: childhood, upbringing, relationships. The man answered calmly, describing a life free of dramatic hardship. No abuse. No trauma. No instability. Yet as he spoke, his voice carried no attachment to the experiences he described. They were events, not memories. People were roles, not relationships. He didn't speak as someone recalling his life. He spoke as someone reciting its outline. As the conversation moved toward adulthood, a clearer pattern emerged. He lived a routine-driven, socially distant life. He maintained responsibilities without forming bonds. He interacted politely but superficially. He didn't argue. He didn't connect. He simply existed within the structure society provided. This emotional flatness became more pronounced when Berry-Dee asked about stressors, conflicts, or emotional overwhelm. The man paused longer than necessary, as though searching for the expected answer rather than the authentic one. He claimed he experienced frustration and anxiety, but the words landed without weight. He described emotions the way a colorblind person might describe colors, conceptually, not experientially. Then Berry-Dee shifted to the period before the crime, and something in the man's demeanor tightened, not dramatically but subtly, like a string pulled a fraction too taut. He described feeling pressured, strained, overloaded, yet none of these descriptions had emotional texture. It wasn't clear if the pressure was real or a narrative meant to support his developing insanity claim. But the event itself dismantled his narrative. When Berry-Dee asked about the crime, the man delivered a dispassionate account, devoid of panic or remorse. He detailed his movements with a precision unsettling in its neutrality. He described the moment he acted as though walking through a routine. No emotional surge, no perceived threat, no internal fracture. Just a sequence of decisions executed with mechanical clarity. When Berry-Dee asked what he felt afterward, the man hesitated. Not from grief. Not from fear. But from calculation, an attempt to identify which answer would seem most acceptable. Finally he said, "I suppose I felt confused." But confusion was not the emotion reflected in his eyes. Berry-Dee tested him gently. "What part confused you?" The man blinked slowly. "I didn't expect consequences to unfold the way they did. Not guilt. Not shock. Just an unexpected outcome." This was the glimpse of truth beneath his constructed explanation. The insanity plea had entered the picture late, only after overwhelming evidence eliminated all other defenses. Suddenly he began describing dissociation. Suddenly he claimed episodes of unreality. Suddenly he recalled nothing about the act itself. But these new claims lacked authenticity. His effect never changed. His memory didn't show natural fragmentation. His emotional responses didn't align with his story. Yet something deeper lingered beneath the surface. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't psychotic. But he wasn't stable either. There were signs, subtle but present, of cognitive strain. Moments where his thoughts drifted slightly off course. Moments where he took a fraction too long to process emotional questions. Moments where his neutrality cracked into something sharp and momentarily unfiltered. This wasn't classic madness. It wasn't manipulation alone. It was a personality built on shaky emotional foundations, struggling to maintain the appearance of control. Berry-Dee leaned in slightly. "Why do you think you acted that day?" he asked softly. The man stared at the table, his calm finally thinning. "I don't know," he murmured. Something felt off. Like I wasn't inside myself properly. But I still knew what I was doing. It was the closest he would come to truth. A fragmented mind that never fully lost reality, yet lacked the emotional mechanisms to process pressure, conflict, or consequence. A mind that could commit violence not out of delusion, but out of emotional vacancy. As the interview ended, he thanked Berry-Dee politely, then returned to his stillness, as though the conversation had been an intellectual exercise rather than a dive into the darkest moment of his life. Walking into the corridor, Berry-Dee felt the same heavy realization he had encountered in so many cases. The legal definitions of sanity were too rigid for the fluid, unpredictable ways the mind could break, or fail to develop fully. And waiting in the next file was a case that pushed the boundary further. A person whose emotional void wasn't collapse but construction, revealing a danger no insanity plea could ever explain away. The next file greeted Berry-Dee like a puzzle with missing pieces. Frustrating, contradictory, and designed to resist easy conclusions. This was not the cold logic of a calculating mind, nor the quiet deterioration of someone slipping beneath emotional weight. This case lived in the grayest of gray zones, where fragments of instability tangled with conscious choice, and where even the most experienced forensic professionals disagreed sharply on what, exactly, had gone wrong inside this mind. When Berry-Dee entered the room, the offender sat with perfect posture, hands folded gently in his lap. He looked up with a neutral expression. No performance, no hiding, but also no vulnerability. His stillness wasn't chilling like the previous case. It felt suspended, as though he were waiting for the world to tell him how he should feel. Berry-Dee began with familiar questions. The man answered with clarity, describing a childhood free from chaos or trauma. Yet his voice carried no color, just descriptions delivered with a calmness that felt detached. He mentioned friendships, but there was no warmth in his recollection. He talked about hobbies but without enthusiasm. His memories sounded factual but not lived. It wasn't emptiness. It was distance. As they moved into adulthood, subtle cracks emerged. He described periods where the world felt sharper than usual, sounds too loud, emotions too intense. He mentioned stretches where he felt disconnected, as though he were observing his body move rather than directing it. He didn't describe hallucinations. He didn't describe delusions. He described something far trickier, a loosening grip on emotional reality. Berry-Dee recognized this pattern. The mind wasn't broken, but it wasn't holding together effortlessly either. When the conversation shifted toward the weeks before the crime, the man's tone shifted almost imperceptibly. He described feeling overwhelmed without knowing why. He felt watched, not by imaginary figures, but by the weight of expectations he couldn't articulate. He experienced moments where decisions felt foreign, as though someone else were choosing while he stood on the sidelines. Not psychosis. Not delusion. Something in between, diminished sense of self-agency. Then Berry-Dee asked about the day of the crime. The man hesitated. Not dramatically, just a soft pause, a slight tightening of his fingers. He described the day as dense. He felt pressure behind his thoughts, his mind crowded with impulses he didn't quite identify as his own. Colors felt too bright. People's voices felt too sharp. Every sound seemed to pierce instead of blend. His inner world became chaotic, messy, noisy, overwhelming. But here was the critical point. He still understood where he was. He knew who he was with. He knew right from wrong. His grasp on reality never slipped fully, only wavered. He described the moment of the act with fragmented clarity. He felt a physical sensation, like his chest constricted and his awareness narrowed into a tunnel. His thoughts muddled. His perception distorted. He claimed he felt removed, not fully in control but also not entirely absent. It was a half-awareness, dangerous precisely because it lived between lucidity and collapse. When it was over, clarity returned quickly. Too quickly to support a full insanity claim. He understood what he had done. He understood the consequences. He understood the horror. And he broke. He didn't flee. He didn't fabricate. He confessed with genuine confusion, as though he couldn't reconcile the person he believed himself to be with the one who had acted moments earlier. Berry-Dee asked gently, "Do you think you meant to do it?" The man closed his eyes, jaw trembling. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't think so. But I didn't stop it either." It was a devastating admission, not an excuse, not a denial, but a rare moment of honest ambiguity. This was the kind of case that pushed the limits of forensic evaluation. He wasn't a cold predator. He wasn't a delusional psychotic. He wasn't a fragile collapse. He was a man whose emotional and cognitive stability cracked under pressure, but not enough to sever reality entirely. The law, however, demands clarity. Mad or sane. Responsible or not. But minds like his don't fit the dichotomy. He lived in a space where responsibility existed, but so did impairment. Where the act was intentional, but the mind performing it was compromised. Where he understood reality but couldn't regulate himself within it. As the interview ended, Berry-Dee noticed something telling. When standing, the man adjusted his shirt cuffs with delicate care, a gesture too poised, too mindful, too controlled. A gesture that revealed he hadn't fractured beyond recognition. He simply fractured enough. And that enough made him far more complex, and far more troubling, than the legal system was equipped to handle. Leaving the room, Berry-Dee felt a weight settle across his chest. Cases like this forced him to confront the limits both of psychiatry and of justice. They exposed the uncomfortable truth that some minds exist in a liminal state, neither healthy nor insane, neither fully responsible nor fully excusable. And ahead, the next file promised to push him deeper into that liminal space, a mind where instability and manipulation weren't opposites, but partners twisting around each other in a way that made truth almost impossible to untangle. The next case, thick with conflicting reports, psychiatric disagreements, and courtroom contention, pulled Berry-Dee into one of the most treacherous psychological terrains he had encountered on this journey. This offender's mind was not fractured in the dramatic sense, nor was it numb in the chilling, emotionless way seen in sociopathy. Instead, it existed in a swirling, unstable middle ground, where genuine instability met conscious manipulation. Sometimes he was lost inside his own distorted perceptions. Other times he seemed to exploit those distortions with unnerving precision. This was a mind where truth and performance intertwined so tightly that even he might not have known where one ended and the other began. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the man was already speaking, to himself. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just quietly, as if solving a puzzle aloud. His fingers tapped an uneven rhythm on the table, the tempo shifting whenever his thoughts drifted. He didn't look up immediately, as though Berry-Dee's presence had entered the room on a delay. Then without warning the tapping stopped. He turned, eyes sharpening with sudden lucidity. "You're the one who talks to people like me?" he said, tone shifting into something almost charming. The abrupt change was jarring, not because it was dramatic but because it was too smooth, too controlled. Berry-Dee introduced himself calmly, observing how the man's demeanor shifted again, this time into something quieter, more uncertain, like a person trying to remember the script they had prepared. The early questions revealed a fractured but functional history. No dramatic childhood trauma. No overt psychosis. But there were subtle warning signs that hindsight illuminated clearly. Intense mood fluctuations no one understood, impulsive behaviors dismissed as immaturity, periods of emotional detachment followed by bursts of erratic energy. He was a man who lived his life on uneven ground, slipping in and out of psychological clarity like a faulty light switch. As Berry-Dee guided him toward more personal topics, the man's narrative wavered. At moments, he spoke with genuine vulnerability, eyes softening, voice trembling slightly as he described feeling too many things at once, emotions crashing over him like waves he couldn't control. He talked about waking up some mornings feeling disconnected from himself, as though his thoughts were scattered across the room. But then the shift came. His tone sharpened, confidence swelling. He began describing experiences with theatrical flair, shadows speaking to him, messages hidden in everyday sounds, a world alive with conspiracies that only he could decode. Yet these descriptions were inconsistent, lacking the experiential depth of a true hallucination. The voices he mentioned never said anything specific. The shadows behaved conveniently vaguely. The details shifted with each retelling, always adjusted, always exaggerated just slightly when he sensed it might secure sympathy. He was unstable, yes, but he was also performing. And that mix made him uniquely dangerous. When the conversation moved toward the crime, his demeanor fractured again. His voice shook as he described feeling overwhelmed, suffocated by internal chaos. He claimed he acted in a state of emotional overload, the world blurring into something he couldn't navigate. His hands trembled slightly, this time not deliberately but from a genuine memory of panic. Yet his description of the actual act carried a clarity that betrayed him. He remembered small details with precision. He recalled choosing the exact moment he acted. He described steps taken before the chaos erupted. Planning, positioning, opportunity. His instability did not erase his intention. And his intention did not fully erase his instability. Berry-Dee leaned into that tension. "Were you in control?" he asked gently. The man froze, not in confusion but in calculation. His eyes flickered with the awareness that the answer mattered. After a long pause he whispered, "I don't know." But Berry-Dee recognized the truth beneath the uncertainty. He knew when he lost control and he knew when he regained it. His breakdown wasn't total. His awareness wasn't absent. What made the case nearly impossible was the overlap of two realities. He genuinely experienced emotional and cognitive instability. But he also consciously shaped his behavior to benefit from it when needed. His mind was not split. It was strategically fragmented. When Berry-Dee pressed him on his motives, the man's expression shifted again, the tremble fading as a faint smile curved his lips. "People only care why when something bad happens," he murmured. No one cared before. It was a moment of stark honesty, not about the crime but about his worldview. He lived in a mind where validation and attention became currency. And he used the idea of madness to negotiate his place in a world that frightened and confused him. When the interview ended, he thanked Berry-Dee with a warmth that felt eerily misplaced, like someone trying on emotions to see how they fit. As he left the room, Berry-Dee felt an uneasy mix of concern and clarity. This man wasn't faking everything, but he wasn't truthful either. His mind wasn't stable, but it wasn't broken beyond recognition. He existed in a psychological middle space, unstable enough to be dangerous, aware enough to be responsible, manipulative enough to distort the narrative, but fragile enough to believe parts of it. Cases like his are the reason the courtroom is never a perfect mirror of truth. Sanity and insanity aren't binaries, they're spectrums. And this man lived in the shifting, fog-covered region where intention and instability dance so closely together that separating them becomes almost impossible. Ahead, the next case would take Berry-Dee deeper into that fog, into a mind molded by emotional wounds so deep they rewired perception itself. The next file carried a heaviness unlike the others, not the cold emptiness of a detached mind, nor the chaos of a fractured one, nor the sharp manipulation of someone who weaponized instability. This case radiated sorrow, deep and lingering, the kind of sorrow that doesn't explode outward but collapses inward, folding a person into themselves until their emotional world becomes unbearably small. What made this case so devastating was that the offender's descent hadn't arisen from delusion or cruelty, it had arisen from unhealed wounds that shaped their sense of reality over decades. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the woman inside didn't turn immediately. She sat curled slightly forward, hands clasped tightly, shoulders rounded as though bracing against a memory she didn't want to revisit. Her breathing was slow but uneven, as if each inhale required effort. When she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes carried layers of exhaustion, years of quiet suffering that had gone unnoticed until everything collapsed. Berry-Dee greeted her gently. She responded with a nod that seemed to cost her something. Her voice, when it finally emerged, trembled on the edges, yet carried a determined steadiness, the voice of someone who wanted to be understood but feared what understanding might reveal. He began with her childhood, and immediately her narrative revealed cracks that had never healed. She spoke of emotional neglect, not the violent kind that leaves visible scars, but the subtle kind that teaches a child they must shape themselves around the needs of others. Her parents weren't cruel, they were distant, unavailable, dismissive in ways that left her uncertain of her own worth. She grew up learning to hide her pain, believing vulnerability was weakness, believing needs were burdens. This type of upbringing doesn't always produce outward instability. Instead, it creates internal fault lines, fragile emotional structures that can look stable but crumble under enough pressure. As she transitioned into her teenage and adult years, these fault lines began to deepen. She described relationships filled with unease, an inability to express fear or sadness without shame, a pattern of giving more than she received in desperate attempts to feel valued. She carried an inner void she never knew how to fill. Her emotional world became a delicate balance, one she maintained through perfectionism, people-pleasing, and self-erasure. Then came the turning point. Something happened. A loss, a betrayal, a relationship ending, that tore open the old wounds she'd buried. She didn't describe it dramatically. She didn't cry. She simply stated it as fact, the way someone might mention a forgotten injury. But the weight in her voice revealed everything. The event didn't just hurt her. It unraveled the fragile emotional scaffolding she had spent her entire life building. Her thoughts grew heavy. Her sleep fractured. Her sense of self, already delicate, began dissolving. She described waking up feeling hollow, like she had become a shadow of herself. She moved through her days in a fog of emotional numbness, punctuated by sudden, overwhelming waves of fear and despair she couldn't explain. The world did not feel dangerous. It felt empty. But emptiness can distort perception just as much as hallucination. When Berry-Dee asked about the weeks before the crime, she swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. Her thoughts had become tangled, logic slipping through the cracks, emotion overwhelming her until she felt disconnected from her own actions. She described moments of dissociation so profound she felt like she was watching her life from outside herself. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't irrational. But she was drowning internally. Then came the day everything shattered. She described a confrontation, small, seemingly insignificant, but it triggered the deepest wound inside her, the sense that she was alone, invisible, worthless. Her emotional world imploded. She felt cornered not by another person but by her own mind. Reality didn't distort into hallucination, it narrowed into a tunnel of unbearable pain. She acted not out of rage but out of psychological collapse, a moment where her ability to regulate emotion vanished completely. When clarity returned, she collapsed into sobs. She begged the first responding officers to undo what had been done. She apologized until her voice broke. She never attempted escape or denial. Her remorse was instant, raw, overwhelming. Berry-Dee listened silently, absorbing the pain woven through every word. She wasn't performing. She wasn't manipulating. She was mourning, not just the life she had taken but the parts of herself she had lost long before that moment. He asked quietly, "Do you understand why it happened?" Her answer was barely audible. "I think I broke," she whispered. "I didn't know I could break like that. I didn't know I was holding so much inside." This was the tragedy of her case, the invisible burden that led to catastrophe. She wasn't insane in the clinical sense. She understood reality. She knew right from wrong. But she also suffered from emotional wounds so deep they altered the way she perceived threat, loss, and meaning. Her collapse wasn't an escape from accountability. It was the result of years of accumulated pain finally overwhelming a mind unequipped to bear it. Leaving the room, Berry-Dee felt a lingering heaviness. Some minds fracture outward, creating chaos. Some fracture inward, creating silence. Hers had done both, quietly, tragically, and with devastating consequences. Ahead, the next file would present one of the most dangerous combinations of all. A person whose instability was real, but whose cruelty was deliberate. A mind where madness and malice intertwined so tightly that it became nearly impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The next case in the stack drew Berry-Dee toward one of the most treacherous psychological terrains he had ever encountered. This offender existed at the intersection where genuine instability and deliberate cruelty merged into something uniquely dangerous. Many cases lean toward one side or the other, madness or malice, fracture or intention. But this file revealed a mind where both forces lived together, feeding off each other, distorting one another, creating a hybrid darkness that left even seasoned psychiatrists deeply unsettled. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, he immediately sensed the shift. The man seated inside radiated an unpredictable calm, too still, too controlled, too aware. His posture was relaxed, but not in the way stable people sit. It was a relaxation cultivated, practiced, like someone who knew that appearing unbothered was its own form of intimidation. His gaze tracked Berry-Dee with unnerving patience, the kind of patience born not from peace, but from calculation. "Been waiting for you," he said, voice smooth, tone almost conversational. But beneath that smoothness lay a flickering volatility, like a flame burning just a fraction too close to dry tinder. Berry-Dee introduced himself, keeping his tone neutral. The man leaned forward slightly, studying him with a faint smile, as though already trying to gauge what version of himself would be most effective. He began with his childhood, recounting it with a rehearsed flatness, details delivered cleanly, too cleanly, like facts stripped of emotional resonance. No trauma. No instability. No chaos. Yet the absence of emotion itself hinted at a deeper truth. He was hiding something, or more unsettling, he felt nothing about any of it. But as they moved through his adolescence and adulthood, the narrative shifted subtly. He referenced moments of uncontrollable anger, episodes of impulsive risk-taking, emotional swings that left him exhilarated one moment and hollow the next. He talked about feeling disconnected, but not in a confused way, in a predatory way. He described people as objects in motion, pieces in a system he manipulated with ease. And then, woven through these admissions came flickers of vulnerability. He spoke of nights when his mind raced uncontrollably, thoughts spiraling so violently he couldn't sleep. He described moments where he felt like something was clawing inside his chest, pushing him toward actions he simultaneously feared and craved. These glimpses didn't feel fabricated. They felt raw, moments where the mask slipped just enough to reveal genuine psychological rupture. What made him uniquely dangerous wasn't that he was faking symptoms. It was that some of the symptoms were real and he used them strategically. When Berry-Dee asked about emotional connection, the man shrugged. "People exhaust me," he said. "They never make sense. But hurting them does." He said it with a casualness that sent a chill through the room, because he wasn't boasting. He wasn't trying to shock. He was stating a fact as plainly as someone describing their favorite food. But when Berry-Dee gently probed deeper, asking whether he understood why he felt that way, the man's expression cracked for a brief, startling moment. A shadow crossed his face, fear, confusion, something tangled and vulnerable. "Sometimes I think I'm broken," he murmured. "Sometimes I think something inside me is wrong." His voice softened, trembling at the edges. It was real. And it was gone in an instant. Moments later he was smirking again, talking about fate, destiny, and how people deserved what happened to them. His mind wasn't consistently cold. It oscillated, shifting between emotional storm and chilling clarity in ways that made diagnosis nearly impossible. When the conversation turned to the crime, his demeanor sharpened. He described the moments leading up to it with a level of detail that contradicted his later claims of confusion. He remembered positioning himself, observing his surroundings, choosing the moment. These were deliberate actions. But then he spoke about feeling a sudden surge of internal chaos, a violent pressure in his chest, emotions colliding inside him until they fragmented into something he couldn't regulate. His perception narrowed. His thoughts tangled. His control slipped. And in that moment, fueled by instability, sharpened by cruelty, he acted. When the act ended, clarity returned almost immediately. He described the aftermath with calm detachment, Yet there was no remorse. No grief. Only a faint annoyance that the consequences would now disrupt his life. His insanity plea emerged later, crafted not from confusion but from strategy. He began weaving unstable behaviors into his story, amplifying genuine symptoms, distorting timelines, manufacturing psychotic elements that never existed. But beneath those layers the truth remained. He was unstable. He was dangerous. But he also knew exactly what he was doing. Berry-Dee recognized the rare and terrifying combination. A fractured mind capable of cruelty. A cruel mind capable of using its fractures to its advantage. When Berry-Dee ended the session and stood to leave, the man's expression shifted once more. For a brief moment the bravado fell away, revealing something raw. Fear, maybe, or the distant awareness that he didn't fully understand himself. Then it was gone. He leaned back in his chair, smirk returning, and said softly, "You'll remember me." Not a threat. Not a boast. Just a prediction. Walking out of the room, Berry-Dee felt the unsettling truth settle in his chest. Some minds aren't merely dangerous because of madness or malice, but because the two are fused into something far more unpredictable. Ahead waited the penultimate file, one that would hold a final, painful mirror up to the complexity of human instability, revealing how thin the boundaries of sanity can truly be. The last file in the stack carried a quiet gravity, as though the weight of every case before it had gathered here, distilled into one final reminder of how blurred, fragile, and unpredictable the line between sanity and collapse truly is. This offender was not the cold, calculating type, nor the volatile hybrid who weaponized instability, nor the deeply wounded soul whose pain erupted outward. This final mind represented something even more complex. A person who had lived their entire life believing they were stable, until the moment they weren't. When Berry-Dee entered the interview room, the man lifted his head slowly, like someone emerging from a deep, fogged place within himself. His posture was rigid yet frail, a body holding too much tension for too long. He looked older than his age, worn not by violence, but by the emotional wreckage left behind after one catastrophic moment. He greeted Berry-Dee softly, his voice steady but hollow, carrying the tone of someone still trying to understand what had happened inside his own mind. Berry-Dee began with familiar questions, and the man answered with surprising clarity. His life, up until the collapse, had been structured. Predictable. Quiet. A regular job. A small group of friends. A routine that gave him a sense of identity. Nothing about his past suggested instability. No trauma. No outbursts. No history of erratic behavior. If anything, he seemed painfully ordinary. And that was precisely what made his case so unsettling. As he spoke, a pattern emerged, not of emotional fragility nor suppressed rage, but of a man who had always avoided depth. He lived on the surface of his own life. He never confronted painful emotions, never reflected on internal conflict, never developed the emotional tools needed to navigate distress. Whenever discomfort arose, he buried it under distraction or routine. His stability was not strength, it was avoidance wearing the mask of calm. Then, slowly, that mask began to crack. He described the months before the crime with a trembling uncertainty. Small stresses piled up unnoticed until they became something he couldn't ignore. Financial pressure. Work anxiety. A relationship quietly deteriorating. He didn't talk about these things. He didn't process them. Instead, he absorbed them, letting the weight settle until his emotional world grew tight and airless. He spoke of sleepless nights where his thoughts spiraled, thoughts he didn't know how to control. He described mornings filled with dread he couldn't explain. His routine, once comforting, began to feel suffocating. The walls of his life narrowed inch by inch, trapping him in a mental room with no door. But he never reached out. Never admitted fear. Never allowed himself to break. And then came the final trigger, small, almost insignificant to anyone else. A confrontation. A stressor. A moment where all the pressure he'd silently carried finally ruptured. When Berry-Dee asked him to describe the day of the crime, he closed his eyes as though bracing for impact. His breath shook as he spoke. He described a moment where his thoughts imploded, logic collapsing beneath a sudden surge of internal chaos. He wasn't delusional. He wasn't hallucinating. But his mind was drowning. Fear spiked so sharply it distorted everything around him. He felt detached from his own body, like he was watching himself move while trapped behind glass. "It felt like I disappeared," he whispered. And something else, something terrified and furious, stepped forward. It wasn't madness in the legal sense. It was complete emotional overload, a catastrophic failure of psychological regulation. His intentions were buried under panic he didn't understand. He wasn't confused about right and wrong. But in that moment, reason was no longer accessible to him. The act happened quickly, a violent flash produced by months of silent pressure erupting all at once. And when clarity returned, he fell apart. He didn't flee. He didn't fabricate. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing, hands shaking uncontrollably. He begged officers to tell him the victim was alive. He asked if he could reverse what had happened. He asked if he had ruined everything. It was not the remorse of someone caught. It was the collapse of someone who had never believed himself capable of breaking. As the interview progressed, Berry-Dee saw the painful truth in the man's eyes. He didn't want an insanity defense. He didn't want excuses. He didn't want absolution. He wanted understanding, an answer to a question that haunted him every waking moment. How did I become someone who could do that? No psychiatric label could fully answer him. No courtroom could capture the complexity of a mind that functioned flawlessly until the moment it didn't. No legal term for insanity fit the quiet, gradual erosion that had brought him here. He wasn't evil. He wasn't mad. He wasn't stable. He was human, achingly, devastatingly human. He had broken not because he was monstrous, but because he had never learned how to carry the weight he'd spent a lifetime ignoring. As Berry-Dee stood to leave, the man looked up with an expression that cut deeper than anger or tears. It was the look of someone who finally understood the truth too late. I thought strong meant silent, he whispered. But silence is what destroyed me. Berry-Dee left the room quietly, feeling the echo of those words settle into the core of his own reflections. The insanity plea, the courtroom debates, the psychiatric evaluations. None of them could capture the fragile, unpredictable nature of the human mind. Not the cold minds. Not the calculating ones. Not the wounded ones. Not the fractured ones. Sanity was not a clear border. It was a spectrum, shifting, delicate, and terrifyingly easy to cross. And as Berry-Dee closed the final file, he knew this journey had revealed something deeper than madness or evil. People break in different ways. Some loudly. Some quietly. Some deliberately. Some without understanding it's happening. But all of them, every one of them, reminded him that the human mind is never as stable, predictable, or insulated as we want to believe. The interview room fell silent as he turned out the light, leaving behind a final truth that lingered in the darkness. The line between sanity and collapse isn't a line at all. It's a thread, and for some, it snaps without warning.